All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're tracing the journey of an invention that, honestly, fundamentally altered the course of human history. We take our modern, information-saturated lives totally for granted. But the story of how we actually got here, the story of print culture, is just one of the most fascinating, mind-blowing technological and social revolutions of all time.
To really wrap your head around this, I want you to strip away everything from your daily life. Seriously, can you even imagine a world without print? No books, no calendars on your wall, no cinema posters, no newspapers. Nothing. Imagine a reality where every single piece of recorded information had to be painstakingly created by hand. Just think about how painfully slow information must have moved before the concept of mass printing even existed. It's kind of crazy to think about, right?
If you step inside a royal workshop from the 16th century, you immediately see this incredible labor bottleneck. Just look at the highly specialized labor happening all under one roof. Every single book was this massive, unique undertaking. You had one person dictating the text, a highly skilled scribe writing it down letter by letter, and an artist carefully illustrating the pages. This was an incredibly exclusive process, restricted only to the very wealthy and the very powerful.
Now, we absolutely have to appreciate the sheer beauty and skill of the pre-print era. Imagine trying to write an entire novel by hand without making a single mistake. That was literally the life of these expert craftsmen. In a world with no digital fonts or typefaces, they spent years, decades really, mastering calligraphy. They weren't just transferring information, they were creating literal works of art, duplicating text with a remarkable aesthetic accuracy that required immense, almost unbelievable patience.
Okay, moving on to Section 1, the Eastern Origins.
So the story actually kicks off in China around 594 AD with woodblock printing. They created what were called accordion books. These were printed by rubbing paper against the inked surface of carved woodblocks. Because the paper was so thin and porous, they could only print on one side, and then they'd fold and stitch it at the edge. But this wasn't kept a secret. Buddhist missionaries pretty quickly carried this tech across borders into Japan, while Korea took the whole thing to the next level by undertaking massive projects engraving literally tens of thousands of woodblocks.
And the impact was huge. By the 17th century in China, print had blossomed into this massive urban culture. Merchants started using print to collect and share everyday trade information. Reading shifted into a fun leisure activity for the growing urban classes. And here is why this is absolutely crucial. This was the very first time in history that information belonged to the everyday urban class, and not just the elites. Diverse voices started to emerge too. Rich women began to read and publish their own poetry, and courtesans were writing about their everyday lives. A real game changer.
Over in Japan, during the booming Edo period, which is modern-day Tokyo, print culture visually exploded. Publishers were commissioning these incredibly vibrant ukiyo prints. That translates to pictures of the floating world. And these weren't just dry, religious, or official texts. They captured everyday human experiences. We're talking tea house gatherings, women playing musical instruments, and just this really elegant, flourishing urban lifestyle. But before we trace this technology westward, we have to pause and recognize a monumental technical leap that happened in Korea. In the late 14th century, they printed the Jikji, which contains the essentials of Zen Buddhism. This is among the world's oldest existing books printed with movable metal type. They literally laid the groundwork for this massive technological shift centuries before Gutenberg was even born. Just incredible. So how did this leap to the West? Let's get into Section 2, Print Travels to Europe.
The answer, as you might guess, lies on the Silk Road. For centuries, Chinese paper had been slowly trickling into Europe, allowing scribes to produce manuscripts, but the real game changed in 1295. Marco Polo returns to Italy, functioning almost like a 13th century tech smuggler. He brings the knowledge of woodblock printing right back with him. Italians immediately began producing books with woodblocks, which sparked this incredibly fast-paced European adaptation.
Right around this time, there was just massive tension building up in Europe. The demand for books was absolutely skyrocketing, especially with merchants and students in these growing university towns. But producing hand-copied manuscripts, it was expensive, laborious, and painfully slow. Scribes copying onto expensive, fragile animal skin vellum simply couldn't keep up with the hunger for knowledge. Woodblock printing definitely helped, but Europe desperately needed a way to reproduce texts even quicker and cheaper.
And that brings us to the climax. In 1430s Strasbourg, Section 3, the Gutenberg Breakthrough.
Now, Johann Gutenberg didn't just invent something out of thin air. He essentially mashed up 3 different pre-existing technologies into a brilliant new recipe. Let's break this down. Step 1. He used the agricultural olive press, something he'd seen growing up, as the mechanical model. Step 2. He utilized his expertise as a master goldsmith to create lead molds casting movable metal types for individual alphabet letters. And Step 3. He developed a platen that could press down evenly onto damp paper over those inked blocks. It was a stroke of genius.
By 1448, Gutenberg had perfectly tuned his system, and his first major commercial project, the Bible. Now, the speed of this innovation was absolutely staggering for its time. His press produced 180 copies of the Bible in just 3 years. I know, to us today that might sound pretty slow, but compared to a scribe copying a book by hand over months or even years, this was an absolute marvel of mass production.
But human psychology is super fascinating. People are naturally resistant to change. So early printed books didn't look anything like modern paperbacks. They still closely resembled those old written manuscripts. Printers actually left blank spaces and borders on the pages. Why? Because wealthy buyers still wanted to hire artists to hand-paint and illuminate those borders with intricate designs. They desperately wanted to cling to that feeling of elite uniqueness, making sure no 2 copies looked exactly the same.
So what was the explosive aftermath of all this? Let's look at Section 4, the print revolution.
The sheer force of this revolution is undeniable. Look at this staggering jump. In the second half of the 15th century, 20 million printed copies flooded European markets. By the 16th century, just 100 years later, that number exploded to roughly 200 million copies. That's enough books to completely transform a continent. This is an unprecedented democratization of information.
With this massive flood of books, we witnessed a total societal transformation. Before print, we were a hearing public. People gathered in loud taverns to listen to ballads, or came together collectively to hear sacred text read out loud. But cheap, accessible books created a reading public. Knowledge suddenly became individualized, silent, and deeply personal. People could finally consume information entirely on their own.
But it wasn't just an overnight cutoff where everyone suddenly learned how to read. Printers were actually brilliant marketers. Knowing literacy rates were still pretty low, they bridged the gap. They published popular folktales and ballads that were profusely illustrated with pictures. These cheap printed books would be taken to village gatherings and taverns and literally sung out loud. So the hearing public and the new reading public ended up intermingling perfectly.
To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this one thought. The printing press took information out of the hands of a few and gave it to the many, completely reshaping culture, religion, and society from the ground up. As we swim in today's endless sea of digital information, social media, and instantaneous global communication, how will future history view our current technological leap? Are we in the middle of a new revolution just as profound as Gutenberg's? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.